Seaview Hospital was coming out of the sit-in at Mandl ward, Westland Hospital. Westland Hospital was not there. There's a tiny few remnants of Seaview, which is a psychiatric hospital, but basically on the hill above Hokitika were two hospitals. Well, what happened is Mandl ward was going to be closed, and we had a sit-in, and we involved every section of the community, from unemployed to nuns, Rotary, Lions, councils, everyone that could be involved. Henry Pearson was one of the key people. He was the mayor. Ross Overton was the Businessmen Association president. So we had the whole of Hokitika community, and you might as well say Southwestern, involved. And but what happened after that sit-in, the board got wise to us. That's the administrative structure of the hospital board. They got wise to us, and they cut little bits off the hospital, and then they transferred the hospital to Seaview, and people thought, what's a waste of time trying to fight for it, because originally Western was a fully functioning general hospital. Lindsay Black, who was a medical superintendent, he was a very brilliant general surgeon. Then he started to specialise in orthopaedic surgery. He never wanted to come to Greymouth, but in the end he gave up and went. And I happened to be working there as a general nurse because I just finished my general training after I'd done my psychiatric training, and I went with the orthopaedic unit from Western up to Grey, because prior to that, Western did all the orthopaedics for the whole coast. And of course they had old people's ward and so forth and so on, and that Seaview nearby. So those services, it's really a commentary on the whole of New Zealand, because those sorts of services have all been run down or centralised. And when you centralise, say, orthopaedic services in the big cities, it's the little areas, the rural areas that miss out. And that's what's really happened, So Seaview Hospital started off as Hokitika Jail, and like nearly all modern mental hospitals, the jail was converted into a psychiatric. It tarted up a wee bit, because before that the mentally ill were locked up in prisons, and of course it's quite simply, it was cheaper of course, but it didn't work, because if a person was still unwell when they were chucked out of the prison, they'd soon be back in the prison. And and there wasn't really the demand for a coast. There was jails in Hokitika and Greymouth and possibly in West, but I don't know, in the real early days. But once things settled down a bit, and the sort of more settled community, not just cosmopolitan in the gold mining days, there wasn't really the need for so many prison beds, but there was the need for psychiatric beds. So Hokitika Jail became Hokitika Lunatic Asylum, and later on Seaview Psychiatric Hospital. And so the Seaview occupied quite a big area, because in those days the psychiatric hospital basically built on monastery principles, where there was plenty of room for the patients to move around, because part of any neurological, which is what mental illness is, a neurological condition, is either no movement at all or hyper movement. So a lot of patients want to walk around all day. Of a 24-hour day, some of them will walk around for 23 hours if you let them, to the point where they exhaust themselves. But anyhow, so Seaview Hospital, or Hokitika Jail, Hokitika Lunatic, became a Hokitika Lunatic Asylum, and it nearly closed down in the 1900s, and then it was upgraded in the 1920s. So we had a fairly modern psychiatric hospital, and next door to it we had Westland General Hospital, which did everything, all sorts of operations, everything. And both of those institutions were originally on the south side, on the banks of the Mahanaba Creek. And the psychiatric unit was part of the General Hospital, and interesting enough, it only had about 8 beds, which is what we've got now. 160 years later, we've gone back to a General Hospital with a 5-bed psychiatric unit, It's how history repeats itself. If you don't learn from history, you've got to repeat the mistakes. But we're just like every other animal species. We do repeat. We've got a certain pattern of behaviour, and even though we might think we should change it, we can't. So history does repeat itself, unfortunately. So if you go back to the gold rush days, the coast had the highest number of hospitals of any provincial area in the country because we're so spread out, but we had so much economic growth. See, Hokitika was was the biggest turnover of any port, and at low tide and fine weather you could just about walk across the mouth of the Hokitika River, you know, but it had the highest turnover of any port in the country. Greymouth was about second, I think, you know. It started like everything else. You know, the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. There was a need for it, see? And people say, oh, it's because of mercury poisoning, and mercury was used for separating gold. It wasn't. It was the fact that in those times we were a booming population. We had people coming and going, all sorts of things, you know. And the industries were heavy industries. There was injuries and all that sorts of thing, you know. Well, the psychiatric hospital and one and the same thing. The psychiatric part of the early Southside Hospital, which is the earliest hospital, going back to probably 65, somewhere around there, or even earlier. Might have been 63, I forget, 1863, I forget when it first started. It just had an attachment, you know, like on the back of the hospital. I think it was 8 beds, psychiatric. You know. But anyhow, how I got involved in all that stuff is I'd been down the Blue River in Bruce Bay, or Bruce Bay and further south of Blue River, basically hunting, shooting, fishing. I didn't want to go in the dole. I wanted to live off the land, which is a good dream, but when the weather pisses down for 6 or 8 weeks in a row, you can't do anything. The plan of me and the cousin was to go crayfishing and in the good weather and cold air basically whenever we get out. But then in the 70s, the helicopter thing took off, and a lot of areas where you could just go and get a deer any day of the week were cleaned out. So it became quite a bit harder to see one deer. $100 was probably another $30 to $50 more than what you get in wages. So it was possible to live off the land, but that only lasted for, I don't know, 3 or 4 months or something. And I come back up to Greymouth, and there was jobs going at Seaview, and it was just a nurse aid job. Then the boss, Percy Atkinson, said, would you do your training? In fact, he didn't say that. He said, you're doing your training, you start on Monday. As short of nurses as they are now. That's how I got involved. But because I've always been active in a stir, and the old granny was a Communist Party member, I had revolution in my blood, see? So even in the first year, I was appointed by the staff as a student nurse psychiatry representative. And it was a bit of a dangerous job because as a student, you were a probationer, and the organisation could sack you just like that if they wanted to. But at that stage, all my bosses agreed with me, and it was their idea, not mine. When I started to see, I knew nothing whatsoever about mental health. I was a jumped up, never come down, full of myself, but I didn't know a single thing about mental health. And so anyhow, I was appointed a student nurse, and then later on, that was in 71, about nearly 20 years later, I was appointed the chairman of the Seaview subgroup. When I went to Australia, I was appointed the president of a union there, Psychiatric Nurses Union there. So I was an uncompromising bastard and ambitious, see? And I thought, right, here's a political career here if you want it. So I would get stuck into an issue, and get all the publicity, a total media tart. I was in the paper, I was on the Powerball, I was in the paper every day of the week, and there's more than one article, Now I'm getting old and antisocial again. So in those days you trained separately as a psychiatric nurse. And then you had to do your training as a general nurse. Then they brought in the comprehensive course, and they phased out psychiatry. And so now there's no specifically trained psychiatric nurses, which adds to the crisis of mental health because people really don't know that all the symptoms that a mentally ill person presents with. And I believe we copied most of the institution in New Zealand copied on England. To the best of my knowledge, England still has standalone psychiatric nurse training. New Zealand doesn't. On the job, it was all on job. You didn't have to go to university. And then they brought in the university and polytech training in the 70s. And gradually it took over. And the reason for that was purely and simply professional power. Nurses wanted to say, we're as good as doctors and all the rest of it, therefore you have to pay us more. It's all to do with political power. It wasn't to do with better training. It's to do with the political power. Yeah, there was schools of nursing at Seaview, and then you could walk one block. It was all on the same level. To Westland Hospital, you could train as a general nurse and an enrolled nurse. Then you come up to Greymouth, you could train as a general nurse and an enrolled nurse. And you go up to Westport, you could train as a general nurse and enrolled nurse. And that really, most of that only finished in the late 70s, nearly up to the 2000s.